Chapter 6. Sticks and Stones. Sticks and stones may break my bones. Chapter 6. Sticks and Stones. Are you fucking kidding me? Xiang had gone from disinterestedly jabbing at the tongue of a dead snake with his pointy stick to dropping into battle stance the moment the ropes came back out, as though seriously intending to take on Fu Shui armed with a twig. Please, Songlan thought, please do, just give me a sliver of a reason. Chao Xingjian, Xiang called out, dancing a few steps back as he stepped forward, keeping tauntingly out of reach. Daozhang, we just fought side by side, and you're going to let him tie me up again? What if there are more snakes? Do you really think this is fair? Xingjian looked decidedly uncomfortable, sheathing Shuanghua with far more attention and elaborate care than he ever did, fooling absolutely no one. But he kept silence, which was taking sides itself. Xuyang's face went hard, lips pressed together. Really? He skipped another 2 steps back, staying just far enough out of reach, and Songlan felt himself running out of patience fast. He sent Fu Shui forth to slice at the nimble demon's legs, and missed only because of a particularly acrobatic dodge that would have been a lot more impressive if the man hadn't promptly misstepped and tripped over his own feet, going down like a tree. Xuyang twisted into the fall, rolling with it, instantly half back up on his feet again, but the brief stumble had given Songlan the time he needed to finally get close enough, clenching his fist tight on the first thing he could grab onto, a handful of clothes and hair and tucked. Instantly going limp, Xuyang fell away, and the sudden dropping weight almost made him lose both balance and grip, but he caught himself and yanked hard, slamming the man down amongst the leaves. Snarling and spitting foul curses, Xuyang twisted in his grasp, every bit as slippery as the snake's, legs coming up to kick at his face. He wasn't particularly strong, though, Songlan distantly thought, giving him a rough shake. Down one arm and most of his blood, fighting the snakes seemed to have taken care of whatever sheer spiteful strength was left. Please, both of you, he vaguely heard Xingjian say, sounding helplessly distressed, and he forced himself to calm down, to refrain from slamming the squirming body in his grip against the rocks over and over until his neck snapped or skull crunched in. Resentment was roiling in his guts, itching through his veins, and it was a struggle to hold back, force himself under control. Then Xuyang bit him, hard. Hissing like something truly undead, he tore his bleeding hand away to clench his fingers deep into cloth and torn flesh, lifted and slammed him down again, and then once again, harder, onto the mangled right shoulder. There was a choked noise at that, a deeply satisfying keening gasp, before Xuyang bounced back into full maddened bloodthirst. His face twisted into something hideous, and he spat back his own blood at his face with a feral snarl, baring his teeth, ready to bite again. Then something flashed through his eyes, and he suddenly went oddly still. "Stop," he said breathlessly. "Stop, it's hurting him." It took him a moment or two to process the words, and then he realized the vile creature was actually trying to use Xiao Xingjian, his compassion, his distress as needless violence, as leverage. In a split second, he stopped holding back, allowed the coiled resentment to erupt all the way through him, all the way out of his arm and fingers, slapping that hateful, bloodied face so hard his hand went numb with it. Xuyang's head snapped sharply to the side, his eyes rolling back, and for a moment, a glorious moment of darkest euphoria, he thought him finally, satisfyingly dead. Then glazed eyes rolled somewhat back into focus, staring up at him, and that half-gloved hand came up to push at him or surrender. Songlan didn't know, didn't care. Just grabbed it hard and started looping rope around the wrist, tightly and with far more knots than really necessary. Going by how very tempted he was to break it, he was holding back, all things considered. Are you alright?" he heard Xingjian say, painfully uncertain, and the worry in his voice was effectively dousing cold water on the seething flames of his resentment. "Just fine, Daozhang," Xiang managed to drill, light-hearted, as though he wasn't bleeding from his shoulder again, face swelling into a single large bruise from the strike moments before. "What's a small scuffle between friends? Don't worry so much. The sun is rising, the clouds are breaking up. The sky's all pink, you'd love it. It was bewildering, the disconnect between the light voice spouting meaningless nonsense and the stark, unwavering look in his two wide eyes, staring over Sunglan's shoulder as though he'd simply ceased to exist. Finishing the knots and dragging Xuyang to his knees to secure his hand behind his back again, he rose as well and shot a worried look at Xingjin. He was very pale, and his face, always so open, still looked shaken and at a loss. But clearly the silly tirade about morning skies and songbirds about to wake up anytime soon did help calm him somewhat. "We should head back," Xingtian finally said, after a few moments of tense silence, looking more or less reassured no one was currently about to kill anyone else. "We need to let that family know that the danger has been dealt with." Xiyang rolled his one unswollen eye as he was hoisted to unsteady feet, but didn't protest. It had been a very long night. He had been soaring, held aloft by purpose and direction, like the eagle so proudly riding the updrafts of the mountain. Now he was back to falling. Xiao Xingdin felt tired to his bones, putting one foot in front of the other. The road back seemed far longer than the one heading out. "Don't do too much too soon," Xuyang had told him. They had both told him, and he wasn't usually one to misjudge his abilities, and either way this had been important. But he would have to admit now that he was worn absolutely threadbare. Judging by the silence of the other two, they were exhausted too. He shouldn't be grateful for it, but silence seemed to be the closest thing to a temporary truce they could get, a truce he really had no right to ask for in the first place. Through his, Xiao Xingdin's, own faulty judgment, Zichen had lost everything to Xuyang's twisted schemes: his home and loved ones, his eyes, his voice, his mind, his life. Out of those, he himself had only been able to atone for one, and help take another. The ground fell away from beneath him at the memory, a fierce corpse like any other, pierced by his blade. He had been relieved at the time to have been in time to save his dearest friend from the attacking monster. That relief will haunt him forever. Cold sweat was suddenly making the morning chilly, and he just barely managed to get his feet under him in time to avoid falling, his thoughts turning in on themselves in even tighter spirals, going down, down. What right did he possibly have to interfere with that justified vengeance? What right, what sane reason to ask otherwise? He couldn't say. "I want answers," he had pleaded, as though the tangled chaos of his emotions could be dressed up in anything as simple as questions. He wouldn't even know where to start. For a moment, in the battle against the snakes, he had fought knowing with absolute certainty that either one of them would be there in a heartbeat, having his back should he need them. A certainty that felt like peace, like love, like home. An impossible illusion, delusion, gone with the sunrise, like mist dissipating once laid bare by the light, no less a lie because it was beautiful. The truth is not always beautiful, nor beautiful words the truth. He remembered the teachings, had thought he understood them. Now, like with so many things, he felt that maybe he had never really understood anything at all. "If you ask me again," he forced himself to think, to follow the thought to its unavoidable, ugly conclusion. "Zichen, if you do ask me again for your vengeance, I will say yes." Sunglan was weary enough to wish for sleep, even though he technically didn't need it. But Xingjian had still looked pale and hollow by the time they returned to the little farmstead, and he was not about to close his eyes and leave his friends sleep unguarded. The peasant family had been grateful to hear the monsters were slain, though frankly the look on them had been more aghast terror than appreciation, faced with their bedraggled appearances. A good thing, perhaps, all things considered, that Xiao Xingjian hadn't had to see that. But they had been given more food and offers to stay and rest for as long as they wished, and were pointed with nervous unease to the well in case they wished to refresh themselves. He hadn't even realized how soaked he was with blood and even nastier things until then. And so they had washed the worst of the blood out, and he had scrubbed his and Xingzhen's outer robes as clean as they would get, and even emptied a few buckets of water over a glaring Xu, who would, after all, be spending some time in unfortunate close proximity to them in the little stable. It probably hadn't helped much, but the principle still mattered. At least the drowned rat had passed out in his corner as soon as they had gone inside, making no further fuss, which was a welcome change. Xingzhen had taken longer to settle down, fretful, as though there were things he wanted to say but didn't know how to, which was perhaps a bit of an irony, all things considered. In the end, sleep had claimed him, though, and now, a few hours later, he was a solid warm shape slumped onto his arm, his breathing deep and calm. He had wondered about that. Xu suddenly sat up with a violent start, and it was only a lifetime of honed reflexes and iron control that kept him from jumping and waking Xingzhen. Xu eyes were wild and wide, and he only settled somewhat once spotting Xingzhen, and then further once his breathing registered. Only then did he seem to notice him, and a look only too recognizable as, "Oh, right, you," flashed across his face. Recognizable and regrettably relatable. Song Lan shifted his grip on Fu Shui and pointed it to the floor. "What is he?" "Oh, I am not going to sit here and squint at the floor in the dark to talk to you," Xu stated, and whether it was exhaustion or his swollen face making the words slurred, it was hard to tell. He just steadily held his gaze and pointed at the writing again. "What he is? A pain in the ass." He bitterly slumped back against the wall again. "Going night hunting within literal days of being resurrected. Absolute idiot." Perhaps just a tiny bit of truth to that, but still not the answer he was looking for. At this rate, it was only Xingzhen's sleeping weight on his arm that kept him from stabbing Fu Shui somewhere other than at the ground, asking his questions in a much more direct manner. He had the words brand themselves into the earthen floor once more, deeper, narrowing his eyes. Xu smirked at him, but it didn't reach his eyes. "He's Xiao Xingzhen. You didn't think I'd have him resurrected into a simple shambling lump of flesh like you, did you?" He leaned his head back against the wall, too, but never took his eyes off the two of them. "I had a very, very long time to prepare the rituals to bring him back," Xu finally said, almost absently. "There are over 100 different spells, tricks, and sigils working together to bind his soul back in his body. It's the most complex and powerful piece of demonic cultivation ever created. Complex and fragile, which is why he needs his rest. But what would I know? So he is human? Alive?" A habitual shrug and just the most minute wince at the movement. As human as anything once dead can be. He'll bleed. He needs to breathe, to eat, to rest. He can use his cultivation, as long as he spends his energy carefully. Xu laughed quietly, but he was slowly beginning to discern variations of his laugh, and this was not a happy one. Can you imagine Shaoxing Jindaozhang having to rely on demonic energy for anything and everything? Even with a dozen nails in his head, he would find a way to rebel and destroy himself. Hardly an option. He could imagine that all too easily. He didn't know which vision sent more bile up his throat, Xingzhen with a dozen nails in his head, or Xingzhen tearing himself apart to escape the resentment coursing through his veins. Will he get better? Tilting his head to the side, Xu studied the sleeping figure for a long while in silence. Don't know. Hopefully. He's already much stronger than I had expected. Unfortunately, since it lets him make stupid decisions and throw himself into danger. He pursed his lips somewhat, as though weighing his options on whether to keep talking or not. Resurrection is easy, he finally continued, concern for Xingzhen apparently surpassing the disdain for him, Or, more likely, he was just spurred on by his natural inability to ever shut up. Any amateur can get a dead body to move. Even binding a soul back into a body isn't that hard, with the right spells and the right tools. The problem with him is that his soul was shattered. He paused, and Sunglan reluctantly nodded to show he was listening. Have you ever had your bones shattered, Song Dao-jang? No, you wouldn't, not a high and mighty cultivator like you. The thing with shattered bones is they can't be set. You can only place them close together and hope they'll grow back to the way they're supposed to. Almost 2/3 of the spells on him are there just to keep the remnants of his soul together. With time, hopefully the shards will grow back into something whole. But for now, if he keeps putting weight on it, the spells will tear and unravel. It would destroy him. Do you understand? The tone was condescending, but he had come to recognize that too raw look in those reptilian black eyes. What would happen to him? The smile he received had no mirth whatsoever in it, just a vicious grimace. If the spell work fails, his soul will be torn apart, completely disintegrate, not just beyond resurrection, beyond everything, no rebirth, no becoming one with the great Tao of the universe, nothing. He would be utterly destroyed, and everything that is and was him would cease to exist. Sunglan felt as though he'd been stabbed by Shuanghua all over again, his whole being going numb. Eyes intense, Xiang held his gaze. Yes, so knowing that perhaps help keeping from doing stupid things. He listens to you. Talk sense into him, or knock him out if you have to. He'll be angry, but he'll be alive to be angry. Dying is not his choice to make. He wanted to argue against that, argue that Xingjin was the only one with the right to make his own choices. But measured up against the thought of him disappearing forever, it was not an argument he felt like having. What does he need? Xiang looked at him in silence for a long while, eyes just slightly unfocused, chewing on his bloodied lower lip. He needs to remember what it is to live, to want to live. He shattered his soul when he died because he didn't want to come back. He needs to relearn to want to. He finally broke the eye contact, leaning his head back to stare up at the ceiling. A soul is a volatile thing. Once dead, it's hard to convince spiritual cognition to get locked in flesh again. Being near death and the dead can get it to tip back over the edge. You saw it at the girl's grave the other day. Upsetting him, making him think of why he, all those bad things in the past. You have to pay attention. You can see it on his face. Sunglan remembered panic distress soothed by nonsensical talk of sunrises, and melancholy silence broken by stupid jokes. Perhaps a bit more thought to that than just their enemy being aggravating on purpose. What does he need? He repeated, then rubbed Fushui twice next to the letters to bring Xiang's gaze back down from where it had wandered off to. He got a sneer for his troubles. Do I really need to spell these things out for you? Weren't you his friend once? He needs to be happy. No looking back, no memories of loss and death. Go new places, do new things, find his curiosity again. Remembering why he came down the mountain in the first place. Do random good deeds for undeserving people, I guess. Meditate on a mountaintop and spout philosophy at the unsuspecting landscape. Something. I don't know. Have fun. Kill things. Why not, as long as he's careful. Have you really never thought about what things make life worth living, Song Dao-jang? That's sad, truly. He bristled at the once, but Xingjin was still sleeping, leaning up against his arm, and it wasn't that hard to shake off the hollow barb. And what about you? Xiang leafed through his library of smiles and settled on a dark and cruel one. What about me? You really believe that you'll have any part in this journey of his? That earned him a horrible little chuckle. Ah, Song Dao-jang, perhaps I should ask if you will. Weren't you the one who accepted the eyes he sacrificed for you and then told him to get lost and never talk to you again? You're part of those dark memories too. What he needs, who he needs and when. That is his choice to make, not yours. Not yours either. Xu Yang just shrugged, clearly a habit hard to break. He could see the torn remnants of his right shoulder visibly hitch halfway through. We'll just have to wait and see, won't we? He leaned his head further back, slumping more bonelessly still into his corner, and it took Song Lan a few moments to realize he'd either passed out or fallen back asleep. Maybe died if he was lucky. Letting Fu Shui rest back on the floor, though still keeping his fingers on the hilt, he looked down at Xingjin, at his pale face and faint blotches of red already seeping through the fresh bandages over his eyes. Whatever you need, he thought somewhat helplessly to himself. I'll give you whatever you need. I just wish you would tell me what it is. Xu Yang slept all through the day and most of the next night, and it was with a certain relief, he concluded, upon waking up, that Xiao Xingjin had had the sense to do the same. He could vaguely recall telling Song Lan to pick up his share of the babysitting at one point during the night, and it seemed the useless goon had actually taken whatever he'd said to heart, feigning the need to rest himself to keep Xiao Xingjin from getting back on the road too soon. Supposedly that stone face was good for something after all. Clearly he could lie through his teeth. He'd have to keep that in mind. By the time they did leave, it was without any particular reason or direction other than anywhere. Something about not overstaying welcome and being a burden onto others. The little family did look relieved to see them go, ingrates, and he blessed them with his most insane, bloodthirsty grin on the way out. Their faces going from humbly apprehensive to pants-wetting terrified was very gratifying. Following the road ever away from Yi City, they walked very slowly, if only to allow Song Lan to constantly tug and poke at Xiao Xingjin's hand. The latter reason was infuriating, but the first part was, unfortunately, good. His chi reserves felt like they had hit negative numbers days ago, leaving him running on sheer stubborn spite since, and without Yin Iron or the now spell-depleted reserves of resentment stored in the dead of Yi City, available to refuel his strength at will, it was becoming increasingly hard to tuning out the heavy weakness in his limbs, the absolute agony of his shoulder, and the arm no longer there. At least the damned birds were finally singing, the sun was warm without being too hot, and there was a lightness back in Xiao Xingjin's steps. Better, far better than the grey, empty body still and lifeless in a coffin. Anything was better than that. Song Lan had taken Xiao Xingjin's hand again, tracing signs, and the blind man cocked his head in concentration, then suddenly gave a soft, warm laugh. Yes, I remember. It sounds beautiful. I wish I could see it. Something about the fondness of the lingering smile very nearly made him reconsider his thoughts from but a moment ago. At least Xiao Xingjin sleeping lifeless in that coffin had been his, only his. Every last vein in his body screamed in blackest raging fury to kill, tear Song Lan's worthless, shambling half-corpse to shreds the way he should have, 100 times over when he had the opportunity. Would have, if the puppet he'd been turned into hadn't been so useful, his utter defeat so endlessly satisfying. Kill him for daring to make Xiao Xingjin smile that way, for daring to share memories with him that he had no part in. But even had he been capable, he had carried Xiao Xingjin's soul by his heart for 2,793 days, throwing each and every spell, trick, divination, and spirit inquiry he had found throughout the world at it. Not never, not once had it answered, not once. Song Lan had held it in his hands for a few moments beside that casket, and Xiao Xingjin had woken up. It wasn't hard to imagine what would happen to that soul if Song Lan were to disappear. Watching them walk ahead side by side, the perfect matching set, was like watching Xiao Xingjin slip away all over again, bleeding out into the dust, going where he wouldn't be able to follow, never once looking back or answering his desperate calls. The last flickers of dying chi burned hollowly in his chest, so akin to devastating heartache he could almost believe he was still able to hurt, after a lifetime of cutting, carving every last weakness away. Laughable. Yet, for once, the very last thing he felt like doing was smile. They walked slowly, in no rush anywhere, much like when they set out traveling together the first time so many years ago. It was easier just walking in companionable silence than trying to talk, but every now and then Songlan would see something he thought Xingchen might appreciate and reached out to tell him. He had been given his eyes, after all. Seeing things for him too was the least he could do in return. It had felt a bit unnatural at first, ever uneasy with physical touch, especially walking and trying to sign at the same time, but Xingchen had begun smiling expectantly every time he reached for his hand, and when the signs he needed were too complex and they had to stop to focus, he even laughed a bit, ruefully, hesitantly amused rather than frustrated with the mutual struggle. They didn't get very far that day, walking slowly and pausing often. By the time they left the road to set up camp in a small clearing of the path, Xingchen even looked eager for the simple tasks of setting up a campfire, nimble hands adjusting large stones into a neat circle, accepting twigs and tinder to start the fire, all the small simple things that had once been second nature to them both. "I'll go collect more firewood," he signed, because, clever hands or not, letting the blind man grope around the forest floor for sticks would be highly impractical, and he would rather see Xingchen settle down to rest for a bit, alone. "I'm taking him with me," he added, and Xingchen nodded, looking uneasy at the mention of the so far painstakingly avoided topic of the unwanted addition to their party. Xu had kept blissfully quiet most of the day, finally taking the hint when Xingchen kept refusing to answer his attempts at striking up conversation, sulking in silence. This way, he had Fu Shui spill out on a flat piece of ground, and Xu shot him a dark glare, but had the sense to trudge along without him needing to physically drag him. "You could untie me, and I could help carry that," he finally said, after a while of watching him collect dry wood, looking increasingly bored. He ignored him. "You'll need to anyway," Xu continued. His voice was taking on a familiar drawling edge, calculatedly irritating, making himself as difficult as possible. "I need to piss, so unless you feel like lending a hand?" He felt himself pressing his jaws together and tried to relax his face. He had spent most of his grown life dealing with monsters, vanquishing endless demonic creatures. He'd yet to encounter anything that could match Xu when it came to instilling sheer bone-itching aggravation through his mere presence. A quick glance confirmed that the man was looking at him with slightly narrowed eyes, as though gauging the effect of his words, plotting out the next inflaming course of action. "No? You're really just going to leave me like this? Bound and helpless?" He grinned, canines showing. "Is that how the noble cultivators treat a prisoner? Ah. Or maybe you enjoy the thought of me having to stand here, humiliated, forced to soil myself while you watch? You villain." Songlan very briefly closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, more habit than strict necessity, to calm himself. "Xingchen would probably be upset if he dies," he reminded himself a few times, like a mantra, "even if it is made to look like a very messy accident." "I'll leash you," he savagely branded into a nearby tree, straightening, the ground too uneven to ride on. Small concessions aside, he had no intention of having to chase the snake down again to tie him back up. "And if you try to run, I'll cleave you in two." Xu smiled sweetly, somehow still managing to summon the innocent look of the teenager he'd been the first cursed time they'd met. "Of course, Song Daojang. I'll be good." Grinding his teeth together, he pulled out an additional piece of rope from his sleeve and tied a noose, while imagining using it for far more permanent solutions than as a harmless leash, then dropped it over Xu head, tightening it flush around his neck. Reasonably satisfied, he finally worked the knots of the bound hand open, wishing he hadn't been quite so eager to tighten them before. Convulsively flexing the claw-like stiffened hand, Xu turned to face him and tilted his head, eyes childishly wide. "A little privacy?" He got as far as turning around in disgust, grip on the leash firm, when he felt something tap lightly against the back of his shoulder. Stay. He found his bones frozen in place, unable to move at all, no matter how furiously he fought the binding spell. Xu Yang stepped into his field of vision again, a mix of exasperation and false pity on his face as he slapped another few makeshift talismans made of dry leaves and blood on his immobilized body. He shook his head once, shrugging out of the leash and discarding it at his feet. You're such a good, kind man, Song Daozhang. It'll be your undoing one day. A brief pat at his cheek, and then Xu Yang was gone, heading off back towards the campfire and the waiting, unguarded Xiao Xingzhen. He sat perched on the log by the fire, shaking pine needles out of one of his boots when he heard footsteps approaching, back sooner than expected, but something was off about the sound. Xiao Xingzhen! He froze at the familiar voice. Only one set of footsteps. Xu Yang? Where's Zichen? Oh, he got held up somewhere. He'll show up again soon. No doubt at the least convenient moment possible. He does that. He stood immediately, unable to shake the feeling that something awful must have happened. Out of nowhere, there was a hand yanking hard on his sleeve, unexpected enough to make him sit back down. Where are you running off to barefoot, Daozhang? A small laugh, amused. Don't go. We haven't had a chance to talk properly since you woke up. I have nothing to say to you, he bit out, hurrying to pull his boot back on. There was a disbelieving snort somewhere right in front of him, too close. Really? 3 years together and almost 8 apart, and you have nothing to say to me? No thoughts I would ever want to voice out loud. All the more reason to, Daozhang. Lance the wound, bleed it out. Better than letting it fester, don't you know that? He meant to stand up again, but suddenly there was an arm resting across his knees. Xu Yang must be crouching or kneeling right in front of him, leaning into his lap. He recoiled and, without conscious thought, Shuanghua leapt to his hand, the bared blade coming up between them, a barrier. There was a very soft exhale, wistful rather than offended or afraid. Get away from me, he ground out, voice thankfully steady, steadier than the hand holding the sword. His heart was pounding, a familiar rush of tangled up emotions in his head. The weight of the arm lifted obediently off his knees, but he could still feel the presence of another living body only inches away. Or what, Daozhang? Xu Yang sounded genuinely curious, greedy for his answer. You'll cut me? Kill me? He swayed with the vertigo of yes and no bleeding together in his head, and when a hand gripped onto Shuanghua's blade, lowering the barrier between them, the sword was nearly tucked out of his faltering fingers. Would you hesitate at all, Daozhang? The man hummed. To hurt me? Or would you relish in it? Is it what you want? Maybe it would make you feel better. Xu Yang was so close now he could feel his body heat through his robes, breath against his face, and his voice was so very hungry. I don't relish in hurting people, he choked out. I'm not like me? There was another laugh, starting lovingly as Cheng Mei and ending with Xu Yang's madness. But that was always your problem, wasn't it? Xiao Xingzhen, you're so good, so very, very good. You tear yourself apart to be good. But I've seen you fight. I've seen you kill. I know what bloodthirst looks like. Stop holding yourself back. That's not... Stop. He was going cold, raw panic flaring from beneath his ribs, and there was still no sign of Zichen anywhere. No air would make it into his lungs, no matter how he gasped for it. You can carve your vengeance from my bones if you like, Xu Yang said, and there was something horribly wrong with his voice. I would let you. Cut it all away, all you need. And if there's anything left when you're done, then we'll be even. We can start all over. Everything can be as it should again. Voice deranged, but choked out with something like desperation. Don't you know yet? That's how it works. That's how the world works, Daozhang. If someone hurts you, you hurt them back 100 times worse. You hurt me, so I heard you. Too much, it was too much. Now it's your turn again. No. This is my heart. The point of Shuanghua was yanked aside to rest against skin, and the grip on the blade was unyielding, but he could feel tremors down its length. If you want it over fast. Another tug, the edge angled. These are my eyes. I owe you. That's what you said, wasn't it? About the flow of things and how you lost yours. You can have them. Shuanghua moved again, jerked down. Or here. This is where you stabbed me that day, remember? When I returned home with food. You met me on the doorstep and you stabbed me in the guts. I still have the scar. I kept it. For a moment the frenzied voice softened. One of the last things you gave to me. A piece of candy and a scar. Maybe you should have stabbed deeper. I've never known you to hold back before. Why did you hold back, Dao Zhang? Why didn't you just follow through? Then none of this would have happened. Please, stop, he tried to say, but his lips felt numb, and he wasn't sure he actually got the words out. Another tug, up again. This is my throat. Poetic justice. You don't even have to do it yourself if you don't want to. You can just look away for a moment. That's all it takes, isn't it? Just looking away for a moment. Xu Yang was actually crying now, impossibly, voice shaking so much that the words came out broken into jagged pieces. The hand holding onto the blade fell away, a clumsy four-fingered grip clenching desperately into his sleeve, through the fabric to lock onto his arm beneath. Just do it. Do whatever you need to. Whatever you want. Set it right. You can make it right. Finally managing to pry his cramped hand open, he let Shuanghua fall, and he could feel the hand on his arm flinch violently at the sound it made when it hit the ground. Stop, he tried one last time, but only a broken sound came out. His lips tasted of blood, his own tears. It seemed the one thing Xu Yang and Sijin both wanted from him was the one thing he couldn't give, no matter how much he should, no matter how much he should want to. He felt weightless, a hurricane locked inside his skull, so loud he couldn't hear if Xu Yang said anything more. Perhaps a blessing. He had owned a little teacup once on the mountain, a treasured delicate thing of white porcelain, and in a careless moment he had dropped it. It had still looked whole, but the next time he poured hot water into it, it had made a tinkling, almost musical sound, the water draining out of it as all the invisible cracks opened at once. Even then it had still looked like a whole cup, only crackled, and it wasn't until he tried picking it up that it fell into 100 pieces at his touch. The roaring storm in his head had reached a crescendo so overwhelming it was almost bleeding into silence, and in that silence he could hear his heart making that almost musical tinkling sound, shattered, all cracks breaking open at once. If you don't understand the world, you shouldn't have come, he'd been told, and dejectedly he thought, I don't, I really don't. I thought I did, but I don't. I wanted to, but I don't. Maybe I really am not meant to be here. He allowed the hurricane to take him, then carry him away, away from the hand frantically tugging at him, the echo of someone screaming his name as though it was the only sound left in the world. A world he had never been meant to know.